Hello! I am making a video about jQuery UI. And what is jQuery UI? It is an extension of the standard jQuery library that gives you a bunch more features largely related to the idea of the user interface and different kinds of user interactions that you might want to make available on your web page. I feel like initially jQuery UI was in response to some of the limitations that standard HTML had in representing especially input elements and those sorts of interactions. But HTML has since become quite a lot better at that. However, jQuery UI does provide some really cool features and some really nice ways to get user interface elements working on your web page, and highly stylable user interface elements as well. So it's a really interesting library. It lets you do some quite cool things fairly simply, and that's why it remains a really good thing for us to learn. So what I'm going to do in this video is a quick introduction to just sort of what jQuery UI looks like and what's possible, and I'll save the actual technical engagement with the library for a bit later on. So the first thing that we're going to do, of course, is go to the jQuery UI website, which lives at, you guessed it, jQueryui.com. So here we are. Just like jQuery, super corporate looking website. They do have a shout out to Black Lives Matter at the top here, which is really great. It's good to see all of these different libraries that are engaging politically, at least a little bit. But yes, as you can see, jQuery UI is focused mostly on business applications, but that doesn't mean that we can't do some really interesting kind of subversive things with it, as well as just learn how to use it in case we need a corporate job at some point in our lives. And so when we look at this web page, one thing that we don't see, which is kind of interesting, is we don't see any jQuery UI code on the front end here. I guess one of the reasons for that is that they have a really good set of demos, and so they're kind of saving showing you what jQuery UI can do for the demos. So I think that the key things to note, and that we'll follow through on here on this page, is this idea of demos here in this menu bar. The demos are super important. And indeed, all of these things down here in the left-hand sidebar, which are actually telling us what's available in the library. And you can see it's broken down into some categories here. All of these things link to specific demos. So we can see, for example, that we've got the idea of making things draggable, droppable, resizable, selectable, and sortable. So these are kinds of, I guess, really mouse or touch-based interactions. We've got widgets, which are maybe the sort of the classic interface elements that you're used to, like a dialog box or a date picker or a slider. And we've got effects, which allow us in particular to do color animation, which is nice because that's something that jQuery Standard Edition doesn't let us do, and other kinds of effects that we'll take a look at in the appropriate module. So the demos is a great place to start if you're wanting to know what's possible. Clearly we care about the API documentation, and we'll engage with that where needed. To kind of deepen our knowledge of how to use jQuery UI. So always important to identify where that is. There's a download page where we can obtain the library. And indeed, you can see there's a little box here that lets us download the latest version of jQuery UI. And also there's this idea of themes that comes along with jQuery UI. It comes with custom CSS that you use to style, in particular, the widgets that you end up using. And we'll talk a little bit at the end of this video about how those themes work. So let's go and take a look at the website. The main thing really that we want to look at is the demos. We've already looked at these categories. I'm just going to go to the very first one, which is the Draggable Interaction. So I can either get there by clicking through the demos link up here, or I can just click on the interaction that I'm interested in here, and it will take me to the information page. So they don't really go for glitz and glamour. This is the demo here, and it does what it promises, right? I can drag this HTML element around, and that's what it does. Hey presto. So that's what a draggable thing is in jQuery UI. It enables us to actually make something draggable. If you're unsure of what the demo is doing, we have a little description down here, enable draggable functionality on any DOM element. So a div, a p tag, an input element, anything can become draggable thanks to jQuery UI, and you move things by clicking with the mouse and dragging. I mean, this is not rocket science. So that's great. So we see the demo, which is neat. What would we do next? Well, we might sort of rub our hands together and feel super excited. We might notice that there are further examples down here on the right-hand side that we could look at, more specific elements of this draggable functionality. But really the first thing we should make sure that we notice is this tiny, strangely tiny link here that says view source. And this is what's going to enable us a lot of the time to work out how to do stuff in jQuery UI. The demos are pretty fully featured, and they all come with their source. So let's look at the source for this basic draggable demo. One of the first things to notice, and this is common, I think you may even be used to this by now, it's presented as just entirely as just a single HTML document that you could paste into a project and have it work immediately if you have all of the requisite files. But it's not split up right into a JavaScript file, a CSS file, and an HTML file. It's all in one place. So that means that we have to be able to read this, right? So in particular, we can see there's two CSS files here that are being used. So that's something. And notice that there's a jQuery UI CSS file specifically. So we'll come back to that when we're actually trying to use the library ourselves. There's a little bit of styling specific to this demo, which is what's making this box the dimensions that it has. And then there's some CSS. You can see that they're including jQuery itself here first. Quite an old version of jQuery, 1.12.4. And then they're including the jQuery UI library as well. So there's a fair few things that you need to include to get jQuery UI working. That's maybe one of the first impressions that we can get from this. I'll just skip down to the body here. You can see that there's just, the thing that we're making draggable is just a div, right? It's a div, it's got an ID of draggable, and it also has a class, and then it has some text inside it, inside this p tag. Okay, so that's all that there is that's being included in this demo. So that div is this thing here. So then we ask ourselves, well, I mean, and I'm sure you've already seen this, but how do we make it draggable? We look inside this little specific script that's specific to this example. And here we see a bit of a red herring. There's this weird kind of function shape thing here around the code that it's actually executing. Don't worry about this. This is just a way of getting a function to run on a page using jQuery. We don't really care about this, I will argue for you. What we care about is what's inside it. This is really the jQuery UI code that is being used to make that element draggable. And you can see it's extremely, oh, sorry about that. It's extremely simple, right? It's one line of code. Up front, we have the very familiar jQuery approach of selecting a specific element on a page. Here we're selecting the div by its ID, so we say #draggable. And then there's just a method that we apply to that. This method is coming to us thanks to jQuery UI. We just write .draggable to call the draggable method with the parentheses, of course, to execute it. And that makes it draggable. That's the extent of it. And this is why jQuery UI is kind of so neat, right? We just target something, we select something with jQuery, we say .draggable to call the draggable method, and hey presto, it becomes draggable. That's pretty exciting, and that's sort of representative of how powerful a library like this can be, right? Because it's simplifying a whole ton of stuff that otherwise we would have to implement. So at heart, this is a nice simple library that we can look forward to using for its simplicity. If we delve further into this, we can find all kinds of other things. And of course, if we look at all of these other examples, like let's look at Resizable, for example. We'll just click across to that. Again, I would always want to reopen the source, but to just double check. So this isn't draggable. However, you can see it's got a little toggly thing here. My cursor is turning into an arrow. And this allows me to resize any HTML element, any DOM element. Also, super cool, super flexible. How's that being done? You might not be surprised to see that down here in the code. And at this point, because we've kind of parsed how they write these things, we can just kind of jump to the code that's inside this funny function thing, you can see it's, again, target the thing you want to be resizable, and then just call this resizable method, and hey presto, it becomes resizable. So again, super, super powerful, tiny amount of code. And this, this demo style applies to absolutely everything that you see here in this list of demos down on the left-hand side. So I'm not going to go through all of these. We've seen the basic idea, which is you click through to a demo, you can experience the demo interactively, and you can look at the source code that is used to accomplish that demo. Obviously, there are more complicated things going on. We'll look at those when we actually look at some of these interactions and widgets, etc., in some depth. Okay, so do explore what's available and get a sense of what you might want to do with jQuery UI. Okay. Now, the other thing to take note of, I'll just go back to Draggable since we will talk about this in a separate video. The other thing to make sure that you notice is when you're looking at a demo, there's always a link to the API documentation for the thing that's being demoed. So in this case, if I were to click through here to this link, API documentation, it would take me to all of the information about the draggable. They call it a widget. So that draggable method that we're using to make something draggable, there's a lot of documentation about how that works that takes you into a much, much more specific world of what you need or what's possible with it. And we'll talk about that separately as well. You can also get to the API documentation, of course, by clicking through up here. And here we can look through these categories over here to find what we're maybe looking for. So for example, again, if I'm looking for draggable, I would click through to the API documentation as I have, then interactions, and then I could search through, and in fact it's at the top here, right? Draggable widget is the interaction that I'm interested in, and then I end up back at that same documentation page. There's also a search bar up here, so if I'm interested in dragging, I could also type in draggable, and I could either get the examples, or I could go to specific parts about it. So maybe I'll click on the quick nav examples, right? So then we get into this, this documentation again. Okay, so that's the API. We'll use that, as I said, in other videos when we're wanting to get some specific information. But just being aware that it's there is really important. So the third thing that we want to do after looking at the demos and sort of acknowledging the power of the API is we want to just take a look at how we would obtain jQuery UI. And we've already seen through the demos part of what's required there, right? If I go back to that draggable demo by clicking back a few times, maybe more times than I entirely wish I would, remember we were looking in here at the stuff that's being included to run jQuery UI, and we saw that there is CSS that needs to be included specifically for jQuery UI. So there's a CSS component. We also have to include jQuery, the standard jQuery, because jQuery UI extends on that, so it doesn't include it by default. And then finally, of course, as we know, you have to include the jQuery UI library itself. There's sort of three big things that you need to include anytime you're going to use jQuery UI. How would we get these things? Well, we know how to get jQuery already because we've already looked at jQuery, so we could download it from jquery.com or we could use the CDN code.jquery.com to obtain it as a script tag that links to it on the cloud. How do we get jQuery UI? Well, we saw that when we were back on the home page, if I head back to the home page here, there's download options here. And if I click on these different download options, most obviously I might go for stable. Most obviously, if I click on this, it will download a zip file of all of the things that I need to run jQuery UI, which is the main CSS and the main library file, right? Or if I want to, and I find this simpler myself, I could also go to code.jquery.com. So we already know that we can obtain jQuery here, and I see that they've already updated jQuery since I was last looking at it. So now we have jQuery Core 3.6. So it's been a new release since I was last looking at this, when I was looking at 3.5.1. And if we just scroll down a teeny bit, we get to jQuery UI here as well, right? And again, it gives us our options for obtaining jQuery UI. We might as well use the most recent version, 1.12. And we can click on minified, that's probably what we want, and that'll give us, as with jQuery standard or core jQuery, it'll give us the script tag that we can then include in our index.html. And then, as I was talking about, we've got this idea of CSS that we need to include with jQuery UI. What that CSS is often described as is a theme. So if, for example, I click through one of these themes, base is the default, nothing fancy. But you can see there's lots of other possible, like Cupertino, eggplant. I don't know if anybody ever wants to use eggplant, but they can if they want. Hot sneaks, they've got pretty weird names. If I click through to base here, which I'm a vanilla kind of guy, it'll take me to the actual CSS file. So this URL up here is what we would link to in our index.html to include the CSS in our project, which we need to do to be able to use jQuery UI. Okay, so those are the three things, right? Get jQuery. I'm going to get it generally through the script tag on code.jquery.com, the CDN. Get the jQuery UI library. I'm going to do that through its script tag on the CDN as well. And get probably a default CSS theme, unless you're wanting to do something special. And I'm going to do that again via code.jquery.com and navigate to, for me, the base CSS file, which I need to link to in my HTML. We'll go through this in the subsequent video, so we actually do it with a project. Okay, so that is how we are going to obtain jQuery, just so that we've done the inspection of the website and we know what our strategy is going to be for getting the library when we do want to use it. The final thing I just want to take a little quick look at is this larger idea of themes. So we saw that there were some custom pre-made themes that we could have chosen from the CDN there if we wanted to, but it goes deeper than this. So if we click on the themes option here, what we actually get to is this thing called Theme Roller. And what Theme Roller does is it presents us with all of the different components that come with jQuery UI, like accordion menus, for example, which I can expand as such. If I can write JavaScript, I don't know. There we go. So there's some things that it will autocomplete for me. So there's an autocomplete form, buttons, etc., 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 radio buttons. You know what these things are. I don't need to explain them. By default, it opens up in this roll your own setting. We can also look at the gallery of other existing themes that we can obtain. So we could find out what eggplant looks like, for example. Looks like that. It's not as bad as I thought. And I'll just go back to the base, if we click on roll your own here, we can actually go through and change all of the settings. So for instance, if I want to make everything oddly big, I could say that the size of all fonts begins at 2 rem. And now it looks terrible because it's not a very good idea. But you can see that it instantly worked, right? It's also actually defaulted back to the eggplant, which is not what I wanted. That surprised me a little tiny bit. But you can see that we can change what's going on in the actual way that this is working by changing things here. And obviously we can change colors as well. So we could change maybe the background color of things. There's a color pick. Oh, we can use a pattern. That's quite cool. I can make something red. I don't know what that's even affecting. It's affecting some kind of content thing. Oh, it affected maybe that. No, doesn't seem to have done very much. That was a bit disappointing. What about a clickable thing? Let's make the text. Just trying to do something that will be nice and bold. There. Did that change anything? I feel like I'm not getting as much joy out of this as I had really hoped. Maybe we'll change the corner radius. That's usually pretty fun. Gross. So you can see by setting the corner radius to 100%, I've made everything kind of try to be a circle or an ellipse. That's actually kind of like edgy. Maybe this is the future of user. Ooh, the future of user interface design has just been discovered. Oh, look at that slider. At any rate, you can see that you can play around with these themes, and then you can, once you're finished and you're super satisfied, as I am with this, you can click on Download Theme there, and after going through a step where you choose which version of jQuery, which bits of jQuery, I would recommend just having all of them selected rather than kind of picking piece by piece. But it's kind of nice that you you can pick piece by piece all of the individual parts, and then you can download that as a zip file and include the CSS associated with that into your project. It's a bit more of an undertaking, but it can be a nice thing to be able to do if you really like having kind of visual control over what you're working on. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to use the vanilla themes when I'm working with jQuery UI, but it's good to know that you have that option to build out a specific visual language with the CSS of jQuery UI included. And so that's it. That's my introduction to jQuery UI. We've seen the kind of the basic overview. We know that kind of at the center of this is the demos that allow us to look at specific features and view their basic source code. That gives us what we really need in order to start playing around with this and having ideas. And of course, we need to look at some of the more in-depth ideas that are included with these features. And that's what we'll do in subsequent videos when we look at some of the specifics and get our own projects using jQuery UI running. So I'll see you in the next video. Herein ends the jQuery UI overview.